to know more such amazing stories from Indian history, click the bell icon and subscribe to Live History India.
Hello and welcome to LHI's Book Club. I'm Minnie Menon, and today we put the spotlight on an interesting book that tells us the story of a whole period through the course of a river, the Hooghly. The book I'm talking about is Hooghly, The Global History of a River by SOAS professor and a professor in Paris, Robert Ivermy, who joins us from Paris. Robert, thanks so much for joining us on the book club. I must tell you, I really enjoyed the book also because I spent a fair amount of time tracing that journey down the Hooghly from Murshidabad actually all the way to Bandel and Chandranagar, and I found the insights that you've shared, the little stories that you've shared, really fascinating. So my first question to you really is, how did this book come about, and how did your journey of discovering the Hooghly start?
Thank you, Minnie, and thank you for the invitation. The idea for the book came, I was thinking about this this morning, 10 years ago when I was a PhD student, spending a month or two in West Bengal. I was working at the time in the West Bengal State Archives in Kolkata during the week, and at the weekend I would go and explore places outside of the city. And most of the time that meant traveling up and down the Hooghly, using mostly the train lines on either side of the river, crossing the river in various places, visiting many of the spots that appear in the book, starting with the Portuguese settlement of Hooghly, of Bandel, and later Serampore, Chinsurah, the Dutch settlements on the river. It was those travels over, 3 or 4 weekends that really put the idea in my mind to write about the Hooghly as a place where those different European presences came together, along with people from all over the Indian subcontinent and further afield. The Hooghly seemed a great place to focus on for a book looking at global and cross-regional connections, I suppose, because of the presence in such a short stretch of the river, really, of those different European and other companies.
Absolutely. So just to put this in context for our viewers, in Giria, just around Murshidabad, the river Ganga splits into two distributaries. One is the Padma that goes into Bangladesh, and then you have the Hooghly, which makes its way down. Now, from there all the way to Kolkata, you have settlements that appeared of the British, of the Portuguese, of the Dutch, the Danes, and the French. And all of this over a period of about the 16th century to, of course, the 20th century. And the whole history of colonial trade, of European political skirmishes, everything played out in this stretch. And that's what's really fascinating about it. So I'm going to break it down to a couple of very basic questions before we actually get into picking out threads from your various chapters, because they're really fascinating. I'm going to start by asking you what I found very interesting, even when I traveled there, is how the Hooghly became the center of all of this activity, while the Padma could well have also been, because you have Chittagong over there. And if I'm not mistaken, the first Portuguese interaction is at Chittagong and not really along the Hooghly. So there is a spatial shift of focus as far as the colonial, the first factories are concerned, where Hooghly becomes the center, not the Padma. Why was that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think over a long period, the Hooghly was the main branch of the Ganges. It was the main body of water when the Ganges splits, that was traveling down across the Bengal Delta and entering the sea. It's only later, from the 17th century, that the Hooghly begins to dry up, but the main body of water for Ganges changes course and begins to enter the sea further east through the Padma and other branches. So certainly at the beginning of the period that I look at, the Hooghly is the main body of water. It's the most navigable of the channels of the Ganges. Although, as we will see, the navigation was very difficult. When Europeans start arriving in Bengal, I think they arrive further east, Chittagong and the Padma, slightly by hazard. They don't necessarily know where they want to get to. So the earliest Portuguese often arrive, in the town of Chittagong. Over time, the Portuguese begin to realize that the more favorable trading opportunities are on the Hooghly, so are further west, because of the better connections with the Ganges and Upper India at the time, because as Bengal becomes incorporated into the Mughal Empire, there is a degree of political stability on the Hooghly that doesn't necessarily exist further east. The Hooghly, we should say, I guess, for listeners who might not be familiar, is really where the delta begins. So on one side of the Hooghly, you have the kind of hard ground of and the hills of kind of that part of northeast India. But then on the other side, on the eastern side of the Hooghly, the left bank, if you like, you have really the beginnings of the delta, with many waterways heading further eastwards. Yes, I think we should note the fact that the Hooghly has been, for many centuries, going back, I think, to the period BC, in fact, that has had the most significant agricultural settlements and the most significant ports, trading settlements, going a long way back in time. So in that sense, it is the natural place for European settlers to focus on, sorry, European traders to settle on when they begin arriving in Bengal, even though it takes them, let's say, 40 or 50 years to really begin to realize that.
What I also find interesting is sitting out of Mumbai, originally Bombay, you have a tendency to look at the Portuguese as a West Coast phenomenon, right? I mean, of course, battle is there, but you don't realize how early the Portuguese actually entered the Hooghly Delta and how they did so by default, which I also find very interesting, because it was really to fuel the Malacca trade that they actually come to Bengal. But this is really, really early in the game, the early 16th century, for instance. And that's very interesting, because they also create quite a powerful base in the town of Hooghly, which, according to you, by the 1630s, even the Mughals couldn't enter without permits from the Portuguese, which I find very amazing. At that time, the Mughals were in control, so to say. So this early phase of the Portuguese is fascinating. How far did your research take you there, Robert?
Yeah, you're absolutely right to say that most people, when they think of the Portuguese in India, focus on the west coast. They think of Goa, especially, and also maybe Cochin. It's only 20 or 30 years that the Portuguese are on the west coast of India before they start considering the possibility of trade with northeast India and with Bengal specifically. So for a period from the 1530s onwards, there's an annual trading expedition, often just one or two ships that's sent from Goa to the Orissa coast, maybe to Chittagong, or if possible, to kind of make its way up the Hooghly to begin trading on it. Over time, the Portuguese realized that model of sending one or two ships a year is not necessarily sustainable. The ships are kind of hostage to the monsoon, to the dangers of navigating the river. And the idea of a settlement, a base, at least a trading station on the Hooghly, becomes appealing. And it's at that moment the first real personality, the first real character in the book, the first chapter that focuses on the Portuguese, emerges, a guy called Pedro Tavares, who was responsible for obtaining the permission from the Mughal emperor at the time, Akbar, to found a Portuguese trading station on the river.
And as I said, they do gain favor, and Hooghly becomes an important point. Apart from Tavares, the other very interesting person is Sebastian Gonzales, who actually had a little bit of an independent kingdom, because this is a period not of just trade, it's a period of piracy, it is a period of slave runners who are coming. And I mean, it's amazing that, these Portuguese, the first phase of this colonial interest along the Hooghly was also very violent, Robert. I didn't realize that because, as you explained, I mean, there were boats that came in and kidnapped people from villages along the Hooghly, along the little islands over there, and then took them onto the slave trade. So this is a very violent period.
Yeah, absolutely. The slave trade is a hugely important part of, well, what is going on in this period. Of course, as the book points out, Europeans are not responsible for inventing slavery in India or elsewhere, but they are responsible for accelerating the trade in slaves. In the case of the Portuguese, yes, Gonzales is an interesting character, Sebastian Gonzales, who is responsible for setting up a small Portuguese colony east of the Hooghly, so further into the Bengal Delta, that is disowned essentially by the Portuguese authorities. It's disowned by the Estado de India, the formal Portuguese empire in the Indian Ocean, with its capital at Goa. So its status is illegal in the eyes of the Portuguese, of the official Portuguese, let's say, but also in the eyes of the Mughal authorities in Bengal as well. So although we don't have any kind of first-hand records of Gonzales's activities, he's certainly spoken about in the memoirs of more respectable Portuguese in the period as a character to be feared, who is responsible for the capture and trade of slaves across the Bay of Bengal, and who is responsible for giving the Portuguese their bad reputation, let's say, when they tried to obtain favor from the Mughals.
The Mughal relationship with the Portuguese is very troubled, be it in Surat, where, of course, they have a lot of problems with the Portuguese. And one of the reasons the British are able to take advantage of it. Over here, you have Shah Jahan lay a siege on Hooghly to check the slave trade. I mean, this is quite amazing. I mean, and we don't often hear of this theater of activity, but do explain to us the significance of this siege. And was this responsible for the Portuguese to lose control of this very important belt?
Yes, so it's 1632 is the date when Shah Jahan resolves that the Portuguese presence on the Hooghly needs to be removed. And there are lots of possible explanations for why. Slightly earlier, when Shah Jahan ascends to the throne, the Portuguese at Hooghly have not offered their support for him. They've backed one of his rivals, which may have been something that riled him. It's possible that the activity of Christian missionaries on the Hooghly and further east in Bengal at this moment was a source of consternation as well. But the records, the Persian records of Shah Jahan's rule suggest that the main reason why he decides to remove the Portuguese from the Hooghly at this point is because of the presence of slaves at Hooghly, and the increasingly close links between the respectable Portuguese at Hooghly and Gonzales and Portuguese outlaws further east. So increasingly, the slave trade and slavery arrives in the Portuguese settlement at Hooghly, and the lines between legal and illegal in terms of the Portuguese presence in Bengal become blurred. Shah Jahan, like the Mughal emperors before him, and Akbar as the first to grant the Portuguese permission to found Hooghly, he tolerates the presence of the Portuguese. To an extent, he welcomes their presence as a source of revenue. But this changes in the year 1632 when the attack on Hooghly takes place after a relatively short siege because of the vast numerical superiority of the Mughal forces. the Portuguese are forced to flee Hooghly. And although they do return to Bengal after that, this marks the moment really where the Portuguese ascendancy on the river comes to an end. And as we will go on to say, I guess, the other Europeans, the Dutch and English especially, see an opportunity to move into Bengal.
Right. I have one question on the Portuguese because, you know, a lot of the Portuguese period was also interpreted by later historians, very influenced by the British. Also, there are two aspects to it. One is, I think, the Portuguese rule or influence represents a very early phase of colonialism, which was marked out by brute power, a lot of slave trade, etc. It was a more violent form. Of course, not that there wasn't violence. I mean, colonialism was, violent in every respect. But what is also interesting is that they're often brushed aside as rogues who came in and, kind of took control. But what is interesting is the impact the Portuguese had at that stage on the cuisine, on food and language, because a lot of that great food exchange with Latin America, etc., played out. And a lot of the food that we see as given in India or in Bengali cuisine actually owe their early introduction thanks to the Portuguese. I mean, we had done a story on the Sandesh, for instance, and how it has a very strong Portuguese connect. So, do you think there is this memory of the Portuguese past in Bengal? Because Bengal is, of course, there, and there's this fabulous cathedral over there, and the Bengal cheese is there. But beyond that, when you traveled through, did you manage to draw the connections from then to now?
It's difficult. It's certainly more difficult than when you visit somewhere like, yes, Goa on the western coast. There is the Portuguese, or the cathedral that now sits on the site of the original Portuguese church at Hooghly. Although it's gone through several iterations. The previous iteration of the cathedral was destroyed in an earthquake at the end of the 19th century, I believe. The final paragraphs of the chapter of the book on the Portuguese presence suggest some of the words that have entered into Bengali and other Indian languages from Portuguese. Yes, many of the food, many of staples, I guess, of Bengali or of Indian cuisine now are imported from places like South America by the Portuguese. We should note that this is a period when Portuguese present in India are usually marrying Indian women. They're marrying locally, so there is and having children. So there is a racial hierarchy, but that hierarchy is more blurred over times, I guess, because of the presence of mixed race children. There is that kind of cultural intermingling. The main presence, I guess, the main lasting legacy of the Portuguese in Bengal is, beyond that, perhaps Christianity. So certainly many of the Christian populations of Bengal before the start of English missionary activity in the 19th century or late 18th century, the Christian population before that really does owe itself to the Portuguese presence, and what's later referred to as the Anglo-Indian community, the mixed race English or British and Indian population in Bengal, in many instances has its origins in that earlier Portuguese Indian population. So if you look hard enough, you can find some legacies, I guess, but it's not immediately obvious on the Hooghly like it might be elsewhere.
So is the influence of the Danes and the Dutch. Of course, in Chinsura there is this Dutch cemetery, but little else. It's now managed by the local church. The Danes have even less of a kind of an impact. very fast, the tide turns in the favor of the British and the French to an extent. And of course, all the European wars get played out over here. But what I also found very interesting was how the British, I didn't realize it, shift their focus to the Hooghly and the East because of a famine in 1630, which has an impact on the west of India, and it is to find new opportunities that they move east, which I found very interesting.
Yes. So one thing that the book doesn't have is a chapter dedicated to the Dutch. So there is a period after the Portuguese fall of Hooghly in 1632 for about the next 50 years. So let's say through to 1680, where the Dutch are the main trading presence on the river. And that's dealt with in the book in the chapter that explains the rise of the English East India Company, because to an extent, the rise of the Dutch and the rise of the English trading presences on the Hooghly go hand in hand in the second half of the 17th century. But yes, the Dutch settlement of Chinsura is founded just below Hooghly, the Portuguese settlement of Hooghly on the river. And then the English turn their attention to Bengal too. So yes, at the beginning, it's Surat on the northwest coast of India. It is the main port of call for the Dutch and English trading companies when they arrive in India. It's partly because of famine, as you say, that in that region and further south on the western coast, that the English start to turn their attention towards Bengal. It's also because of the exactions, the demands made by the Mughal governor of Surat at the time. Trade becomes very difficult for the English and Dutch, and indeed the French, from the 1680s onwards in West India, because of the demands made by the Mughal governor. One result of that is that the English decamp from Surat to Bombay on the western coast, but they also increasingly turn their attention to Bengal. The big attraction of Bengal, well, there are several. One is the textile trade and the possibility that offers. So increasingly, the European trading companies in India are less interested in the trade in spices, although that continues to some extent, and they're more interested in textiles. They're also interested in Bengal because of the food that is produced there, the possibility of trading in that food, but also feeding the other stations that they have set up on the Indian coast with exports of food from Bengal. In the European imagination, and actually in the Mughal imagination too, Bengal has a reputation as an area, a province of India that's not like any other really. It's considered richer, more fertile, potentially also more dangerous, with extremes of climate that are perhaps even more pronounced. That's certainly how it's reflected in the kind of European and Mughal writings in the period. But it's also a place that offers, perhaps more than anywhere else, the possibilities for trade and possibilities for enrichment in India. It's increasingly the place that, yes, the companies turn to for that reason.
I'm actually focused now to the French in Chandna. Of course, the fight between the British and the French is well known, well chronicled. But what I found interesting was how this very early phase also inspired a lot of writing in France against colonialism, which I found very interesting because it was part of the entire research or work on the excesses of imperialism. A lot of that was based on examples out of Bengal. So do explain that to our viewers.
Yes, yeah. This for me is one of the most interesting and most original aspects of the research that I did for the book. So the backstory here really is that the French are late. Certainly later than the Dutch and English, to begin trading with India, to set up a trading company that has the monopoly on trade between Europe and France in their case. So there is a French presence in Bengal and on the south coast of the Coromandel and Malabar coasts in India from the mid 17th century onwards. But the attitude in France towards that trading company is quite ambivalent. The company doesn't receive much government support. It doesn't receive a huge amount of private investment. It isn't, frankly, very successful. That begins to change in the mid, let's say the 1720s, 1730s. So the middle third maybe of the 18th century, when in southern India, French trade, but also French territorial possessions begin to grow, as you mentioned, Minnie, and as is familiar to lots of historians and people interested in the period. The result of that growth of French influence is the conflict with Britain, the 7 Years' War, the loss of French territorial possessions. By 1760, France, any French possessions that did exist have been removed, taken into English hands. And the French are left at the end of the 7 Years' War, so in 1763, with the peace treaty that is signed between England and France, with the possession of just 3 very small trading stations: Pondicherry on the Coromandel coast, Mahe on the Malabar coast, and Chandernagore on the river Hooghly. So we're making our way gradually down the river here from the Portuguese settlements of Hooghly to the Dutch at Chinsura, and just beneath the Dutch, the French station of Chandernagore. The activities of the French East India Company and the activities of the English East India Company are the subject of sustained critique by writers, thinkers in France from the 1760s onwards. So from the moment it becomes clear that the French have lost their possessions and have lost the 7 Years' War. And some of those writers who are interested in events in India in this period are kind of the household names of the French Enlightenment. So we're thinking here about Voltaire, Diderot, Rousseau to an extent, Montesquieu too in an earlier period. Their thoughts, their evolving thoughts in India are traced in the book. Certainly Voltaire and Diderot are very critical of European colonialism. They're very critical of the way in which trading with India had become not just trade, but also violence and conquest. They study, among other things, the tragic famine on the banks of the Hooghly and more widely in Bengal in 1770 and 71, and make a link with the activities of the English East India Company in Bengal in the period. They rely heavily, we should say, in their writing on 2 or 3 strong critiques of European activity on the river, who had witnessed events firsthand in Bengal in the 1750s and 1760s. So there is a disgruntled employee of the English East India Company, William Bolts, who writes an influential text criticizing the idea of a trading company, the English East India Company, transforming itself into a territorial power, a power motivated by conquest rather than simply trade. And a second critic, a guy called Alexander Dow, who similarly narrates the events in Bengal that have led to the deposition of the Nawab of Bengal, the establishment of the English East India Company as the de facto ruler of Bengal on the banks of the Hooghly. Those events are to an extent understood by Enlightenment thinkers in France in the period, and they show an interest in it. Partly perhaps they are concerned by the fate of Bengal and of people in Bengal in the period. They're also using the activities of the European trading companies on the river, the English and the French, as a stick, I guess, with which to beat their own country, to criticize the despotic exercise of power in France in the period, to criticize the French monarchy, to make an argument for the need to sweep away some of the institutions, I guess, of the Ancien Régime in France. So in a sense, their understanding, the understanding of Voltaire and of Diderot of events on the Hooghly contribute to their critique, not just of colonialism, but also of institutions and existing thought in France that contribute to the kind of intellectual currents that eventually lead to the French Revolution.
Right. What's also interesting is, it's a flash in the pan, Robert, because they quickly forget. I mean, Europe quickly forgets the excesses. And of course, while there is some criticism against the East India Company, that's largely to get the control back to the crown. But you also are very critical about the way the British see Plassey or Palashi, the battle over there, and see it as a great victory and portray it as this great entry point of British interest in India. And you see, there was nothing noble or great about that war. It was a foregone conclusion that the British would win. So is there a lot of grandstanding in Britain also around this time of this Battle of Plassey, etc.?
I think what the book tries to do when it tackles Plassey and the English sort of takeover of Bengal in that period is try to sweep away the myths that were established about the origins of British rule over India in the 19th century. So it's really in the 19th century that, for example, the Battle of Plassey is invested with this myth of a necessary step in the transformation of the East India Company into a territorial power, as something that has an element of glory to it, I suppose, as something that, while maybe including some regrettable elements, was ultimately for the good of India and of Britain. It's really in the 19th century that, in an attempt to show the origins of the British Empire in India in a positive light, the events of Plassey are distorted. We see that there is a strong current of criticism in England as well as in France of what is going on the Hooghly. So of the idea that a trading company can become a territorial power, that it can be responsible for the administration of justice, for starting and ending wars, for appointing and removing Indian rulers and acting as I said, as the kind of de facto power in Bengal. Many people in late 18th century London are very conscious of the fact that a trading company shouldn't be ruling, an increasingly large part of, the Indian subcontinent. They're aware of a contradiction between a company set out to trade and make profit, increasingly being involved in government and the administration of justice, let's say, and the injustices that result. The global history approach of the book is really, among other things, trying to understand the movement of ideas between Europe and India, and also, let's say, between England and France in this period. So the way in which English and French writers critiqued the activities of their trading companies on the river, and the way in which those ideas later have an influence in the development of, Indian anti-colonial criticism.
Right. The coming of Calcutta really kind of casts a long shadow along the Hooghly, so to say, because very soon Calcutta dominates. The British start dominating. Everything is kind of vibrant. So what led to the rise of Calcutta? Do you think it was geography, the positioning? Why did Calcutta become such a base for expansion?
So if we go back to the arrival of the English on the Hooghly, to begin with, they're trading in the existing trading stations of Kasim Bazar near Murshidabad, and also in the ruins of the Portuguese settlement of Hooghly. Calcutta is chosen as the site for a more substantial English settlement right at the end of the 17th century, and there are several reasons for that. One of the key ones is the fact that it's better defended. than the other possibilities, simply by virtue of being on the other side of a river. So Calcutta is on the left bank of the river, the east side. Up until that point, the European settlements on the river have all been on the other bank. They've been closer to central India, if you like. They've been more exposed to attacks from the Marathas or other political uncertainty in the period. So what's a village at that time? Calcutta is granted to the English, and the construction of Fort William begins there, and then the town emerges around the fort. But I don't think anybody seeing those events in, say, in the first decade of the 18th century could anticipate at that point that Calcutta would be transformed into, what I describe, I think, in the book as the imperial megacity of the 19th century, really the heart of, the Northeast Indian economy, the Bengal economy, but also the Indian economy, the Indian Ocean, and if we go one step further, an important part of the global economy of the 19th century. There are lots of reasons why that transformation of Calcutta takes place. Many historians previously have trumpeted it as the effects of the empire of free trade that emerges in the second half of the 19th century. So the replacement of the East India Company's monopoly on trade between England and India with a free trade empire in the Victorian period. But what the book tries to focus on in the chapter on Calcutta is the way in which the development of the city was dependent on the mastery of the river itself. So the way in which managing the river, making it more navigable, but also using it for the development of the city in terms of its sanitation, was an essential part of the development of the city.
Absolutely.
Yes.
You make a very good point about how the navigation was actually mapped at a time when the British were trying to map everything in India and try to make sense of it, and how that helped. Because even today, the course of the river keeps changing. It's also prone to flooding, and knowing the river made a huge difference. One chapter we haven't spoken enough about is Serampore and the Danes. They are a small player in the colonial trajectory of that period, but important legacy is left behind by Serampore in the most unlikeliest of ways because of the Serampore press. So very quickly, what was the legacy of Serampore, and how do you see it from your vantage point?
Yes, so Serampore is the Danish town on the Hooghly. We haven't mentioned the Danes very much so far, but they also participate in Bengal trade through the 18th and early 19th centuries, as indeed they participate on the trade on the Coromandel coast in southern India. Missionaries are banned from the territories of the English East India Company. The English company tries to separate commerce from Christianization, and the feeling is that allowing missionaries to enter into its territories, like Kolkata, would be a source of political uncertainty. It would almost certainly provoke opposition. It would potentially even imperil the existence of the and growth of the English territories in Bengal. But the late 18th century is also the period when evangelical and missionary revival takes place within Britain, and the missionaries begin to travel widely throughout the world with the aim, of course, of spreading Christianity. One of the mission groups that's founded in this period is the Baptist Mission Society, by a group of Baptists in the English Midlands, Northamptonshire. So from relatively humble, relatively modest background, the society is founded. It's financed by subscriptions from that part of England, and 3 missionaries set out for Bengal in this period, with the idea that Bengal would be a good place for their missionary activity. They're denied entry, predictably, into Calcutta, but they find refuge. They find a home in the Danish settlement of Serampore. The Danish trading company is far more sympathetic to their aims than the English are in this period. So the English have tried to exclude missionaries from their territories, but what you have is a group of English missionaries who begin operating just a very short distance up the Hooghly from Calcutta in the Danish station of Serampore. The Serampore mission becomes very influential, not in terms of the number of converts that it makes, not necessarily in terms, directly at least, of the spread of Christianity, but because one of the principles of the mission is the translation of the Bible and other religious texts into Indian languages. One of the first printing presses in Bengal is established at the mission settlement in Serampore. The translation of the Bible into Bengali, but into a huge range of Indian languages, actually begins in the first 2 decades of the 19th century. Increasingly, other types of texts are produced at the press as well. The work of translation is very important, and some learned scholars, I guess, are attracted from Calcutta and elsewhere to settle at Serampore and work on those translations. The mission press becomes hugely influential in the production of grammars and dictionaries of Indian languages, as well as the dissemination of religious texts. There are other activities that the Serampore mission, the Baptist mission, is involved in, setting up a network of schools with the college, Serampore College, at its center. But it's really for the activities around translation and printing, and the development, I guess, of a print culture in Bengal in the first few decades of the 19th century that the mission is most influential.
Right. These are, of course, just some of the stories that really stood out for me in the book Hooghly. There are many, many interesting personalities, anecdotes, interesting turning points and milestones that you must read about. But what also was very interesting reading from your book, and also because we traveled over there, is the connection with that period seems to have gradually gone off. Of course, Chandinagar is great. I mean, there is a movement to revive it. There's a lot of evidence. Chinsura cemetery is like a little island in the middle of a regular city or town in Bengal. Bandel is there, but there's a very, very little memory because life has moved on. You see, Robert. But
yeah.
And so a book like this is important just to put in context how important that stretch was in the global scheme of things. But what are the lessons from that today, you think? And I have a separate question on the ecological and environmental impact, but from that period today, what do you think are the lessons from history?
It's true, undoubtedly, that time has moved on, and a bit like the river that just kind of carries on doing its thing, as humans come and go on it and on its banks. We've kind of, time has moved on, and we've kind of forgotten a lot of what took place on the Hooghly. But the Hooghly is extremely important in the history of European colonialism. It's extremely important in the story of, I guess, what we could call encounters between East and West, between Europe and India in this period. In terms of lessons, yes, we'll come on, I guess, in a minute to the ecological aspect, but the relationship between people and the river, or I guess we could say between man and nature, there are some very important lessons to be drawn there. The other key thing to take away is perhaps simply that the Hooghly has witnessed the rise and fall of successive European powers, but also of the Mughals and then the Nawabs of Bengal, recounted in this book. None of the institutions Very few of the practices that have been established on the river have stood the test of time. There is a sense, looking at the long sweep of the Hooghly's history, that phases, events do come and go, I suppose, and there isn't necessarily much left at the end. For the present day, what does that mean? Maybe it means that we need to acknowledge the fact that, and this is a conclusion that the book makes at the end, that power is not absolute, that there are always kind of countercurrents, if you like, that there are always other things going on. There are always multiple stories and possibilities. Another really important conclusion would be that identities change over time as well. So through the encounters between different peoples, new identities emerge, others become more or less important. There are lessons there for our thinking about nationalism today, for our thinking about borders, for our thinking about maybe about what's important, about the kind of profit incentive and how important trade and profit is compared to other priorities. There are some big conclusions, I guess, that we can draw in that respect.
There's also the importance of storing memories, I think. I think that's very, very important, because somewhere, we take nature for granted. We take the rivers and streams that pass through and create these cities for granted. And nowhere is it more evident than the kind of ecological damage that has been done along the Hooghly. Last year, we saw a devastating cyclone in Calcutta, which is unheard of in that kind of form. So there's a lot, and I think you make a very strong point also of the devastation that you have seen along the Hooghly, right up to the Ganga Sagar, which is the island in the mouth of the Hooghly. The efforts need to be taken to kind of correct that.
Yes. So human attempts to control the river are perhaps as old as, well, certainly as old as the beginnings of the European presence on the river. So that there are several things, actually. First of all, there is the attempts to, not just on the part of Europeans, of course, but to understand how the Hooghly works, so to understand its currents, to understand its shifting banks. This is a river that changes direction or changes course regularly. It's fed by many different smaller rivers and streams. There is a large tidal inflow that comes very high up the river, well beyond Calcutta. So the Hooghly is unpredictable. Attempts to understand it and then to control it are an important part of the history of the book. The book makes the point that by the end of the 19th century, there's a growing realization that maybe the Hooghly is beyond control, and the relationship between people and nature on the river perhaps begins to change with the origins of the recognition that the human presence might be doing some damage to the river, that there are environmental costs attached to transforming the river into a kind of an artery of transport, with Calcutta as the kind of mega city at its heart. So it would be nice to think that some important lessons can be learnt from previous failed attempts to control the river, to make it more navigable, and so forth. But we do see in more recent years some quite similar mistakes being made, I guess, attempts to construct dams on the river without necessarily thinking through or showing enough concern for the environmental consequences. The link between human activity and, yes, some of the extreme weather events on the river, the cyclones that you've mentioned perhaps, Minnie. Some people, I think, today appreciate, or perhaps a growing number of people appreciate, the link between human activity and some of those disasters, but there is at the same time perhaps a denial or perhaps an indifference to the damage that people have done and perhaps continue to do, along the banks of the river.
Which is pity, actually, because there is so much to be saved in the river and along the river. And I think really thank you so much for doing this book, Robert, because it's really helped us understand those little towns, those little cities with very familiar names, with steeped histories. And it's helped me tremendously because when we were traveling there, we found so little to go by as far as research was concerned on these cities that I think this book is going to be a great help for a lot of us who are working there. Thank you so much, and hope to see a lot more of you on Live History India.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to speak today.